Cool. Well, welcome. It's our, can you guys hear me? Yeah. It's our fourth and final webinar of the Summer Symposium 2020, which is exciting. For those of you that have attended the webinars up to this point, you'll know this, but for those that might be new to this one, I'll start with an introduction to the National Food Service. So the National Food Service is a network of community food projects across the country centred around the concept of social eating, working together to tackle food insecurity as well as the interconnected problems of food waste and social isolation. At the start of the pandemic, we had 7 branches operating a variety of community-led food projects. Now, 5 months in, the National Food Service network is coming into its own with 15 branches around the UK, and it's still growing. We've come together quickly to share resources and support across the National Food Service network. Existing branches have launched effective emergency food responses and replicated these systems of support elsewhere, supporting brand new branches that have been set up in a matter of weeks. Communities in 11 cities across the country have mobilised to ensure universal access to food in the face of an unfolding hunger crisis. Yet there are still communities that we haven't reached. This crisis is proving just how important a national food service is. Never has reliable access to good food been so important. Never has the precarity of our current food system been so clear. In tonight's webinar, we're hearing from 2 of our NFS members, Louis and Sean, who's going to talk us through the context surrounding the National Food Service within our food system. And we'll then open it out for a free-flowing discussion to hear your ideas on what a fairer food future looks like and the role of the National Food Service within this. So to get going, we'll hear from Louis Pohl. Louis is the founder of Foodhall, the birthplace of the National Food Service. With a background in architecture, Louis has experience researching the real need of communities and launching innovative initiatives that neatly tackle some of society's biggest problems. His previous work includes designing for and helping Long Live Southbank, raising £1.1 million for community-led restoration of the site. Louis is also the co-founder of the Sheffield Contemporary, a design tutor for the European Architecture Students' Assembly, and in 2018, he recently started the campaign for a national food service. He's also a talented illustrator and designer. Over to you, Louis. Can you unmute?
Unmute.
Nice.
Hello. How's everyone doing? They can't respond. So I am, my name's Louis. Thank you so much for the introduction, Katerina. That was, really made me feel good about myself. But today I'm gonna talk a little bit about the National Food Service, but in particular, I'm going to share a few slides about the future of the National Food Service and what that might look like and how we might build a National Food Service going forward. So I've been thinking a lot about this during the pandemic, but it's something, there's been a lot of kind of random ideas floating around in my head. And I thought this would be quite a good platform just to splurge a little bit and just share a few different kind of key ideas that I've been thinking about. My background, of course, is not really in food. I'm, I studied architecture. I'm really an architectural nerd, if I'm honest. So my kind of interest is always had one foot in architecture, but it's always very difficult to understand what architecture means in society today and where it's placed, because in reality we live in a society that kind of doesn't need, well, it needs architects, it needs designers, but it doesn't really know that it needs them at all. And this is a really lovely quote from Rem Koolhaas about architecture's role in society. So architecture stands with one leg in a world that's 3,000 years ago old and another leg in the 21st century. This is almost ballet-like stretch makes our profession surprisingly deep. You could say that we're the last profession that has a memory, or at least a profession whose roots go 3,000 years, back 3,000 years. And this demonstrates still demonstrates in the long roads today. Initially, I thought we were actually misplaced to deal with the present, but what we actually have to offer the present is memory. And below is a kind of a floor plan of the Temple of Solomon, which was actually a social eating space. And this is kind of like really like ancient history is like, you go far back and you find kind of like references to social eating and social, eating architecture throughout human history. So this is the kind of premise of a lot of the National Food Service. Really, it's kind of rooted in cultural norms from kind of vernacular history, as well as rooted in kind of like the present and how we might re-articulate those kind of social geographies that emerge. So yeah, a lot of my thoughts have been about ideology and the kind of shifting role ideology plays in our kind of like food sharing spaces across time. So essentially these on the left here is a kind of like a list of ideology that an author called Thomas Piketty, an economist, has outlined recently in his now famous book, Capital and Ideology, and essentially lays the foundations for these kind of several different systems that in a way defined our history in the last 500 years. And you can really see a kind of a prevalence of or social eating spaces intertwining with these different ideologies. The trifunctional kind of religion ideology had these kind of Anglo-Saxon kind of great halls. You still see it in the halls of Oxford and Cambridge, the Houses of Commons, kind of based on these kind of ideas. And then you saw the kind of like domestic dining rooms and the individualized kind of eating spaces emerging as proprietarian kind of ideologies emerged, socio-democratic ideologies. Things like the coffee houses and the restaurant kind of started to emerge, especially coffee houses where there's large imports around slavist ideologies and kind of like ideas around kind of importation and colonial empire. And kind of in recent years, only 100 years ago, is the Frankfurt Kitchen became really popularized as a form of cooking and eating alone and kind of being alone essentially in this modern city, alongside kind of some typologies like the British restaurants and national kitchens. And at the moment we're in this kind of weird world where we're kind of like, in a dystopian future where there's fast food chains, the supermarket and food banks seem to be the kind of prevailing ideological kind of the prevailing typologies within our food system. So the question is really like, how do we, through changing our social eating spaces and the way we eat and consume and congregate together, how do we create society anew, and our ideologies, how do we recreate them? So during COVID-19, we witnessed a kind of, well, before COVID-19, I always felt that there were like kind of clouds that obscured our vision of reality. In a sense, kind of there are quite chaotic markets that you're not sure how they're stimulated, how they're actually working, what their underpinnings are. It's all kind of quite opaque. There's kind of mass media rhetoric, so you're not actually sure whether people thoughts themselves or they've kind of they've come from the media. And there's all sorts of other stuff like worries and concerns that stop people from kind of engaging with one another. And during COVID-19, my personal perception was that we saw these kind of clouds part a bit like the Holy Grail came out of the clouds and kind of made very structural vulnerabilities visible. Also kind of gave us a glistening kind of faint image or faint outline of the possibility of a new welfare state. And I know those involved with the distribution and the kind of shared creation of food systems during this period kind of felt that feeling. A lot of market inefficiencies were exposed at this time. So like, okay, which shops can continue distributing in a system where, you know, there's still a huge mounting demand, but they're not, you know, kind of subsidized, or they're not kind of like supported by the apparatus that they depend on. And yeah, essentially it kind of allows us to question or open up why the system needs to exist the way it does. And really, are we at the end of a new ideological cycle? Are there not going to be new spaces in our cities? Are we going to see the world anew? And it sounds like a really radical thing. It's like, oh my God, there's going to be this huge ideological change perhaps. But what is really happening is just something quite natural in a state of history. And like, it feels like it's actually quite a natural state of change, looking at how ideologies have always shifted in the past. So yeah, the kind of like, we saw in a way what I would term as a radical social market during COVID-19, where these kind of amazing community groups organized and could see one another for the first time really clearly, and could connect through this kind of new mechanism, which was being built. And we saw like mass mobilization around the distribution of emergency support, mutual aid systems, mutual aid support systems, and so on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the ideas and how the kind of actions and the interactions formed during this period. So like a timeline of how I saw things evolve. Essentially, a lot of kind of ideas of mutualism struck up around, you know, around the beginning of COVID-19, and kind of radical social groups, political groups, and environmental groups, those groups that were already really connected to one another, kind of spread and proliferated these ideas of mutualism. And we saw these initial mutual aid groups spring up around the country. But then these groups, after this kind of magnificent moment where it's like, wow, mutual aid will work, they sprung up and spun in a kind of, not a random, completely random network, but what you call a scale-free network, where the kind of groups spun one out if they were associated with hubs or what you call a means of production, right? So they thrived if these hubs were openly sharing their work and innovations, and also kind of the scale at which these hubs could actively connect with the mutual aid groups and the central state became a kind of pivotal point in the ability for these the communities around the country to organize and kind of overcome problems in their local area. And we saw many communities that didn't have community hubs find it difficult, even if there were mutual aid groups in them. So these kind of, without the means to organize during a crisis, it's difficult to organize during a crisis, in essence. Another thing was really interesting, you know, that we obviously saw was mutual aid groups organize in like in the kind of like the west of the city and not the east of the city, which is kind of like really important to point out, because we saw a spread and we saw these kind of interconnected hubs and we saw these things, and we saw the growth. So the top image is like just 2 days after the mutual aid group started springing up in Sheffield, and the bottom group is about 10 days after that. You see, even 10 days after, there are still large areas that are kind of highly deprivated, that didn't have enough mutual aid support or much kind of enough help. So the idea here is that these groups sprung from, let me just get my quotes up. These groups sprung from pre-existing community networks, and they represent a speed at which a concept can travel through an existing network. And by tracing the date at which mutual aid groups were created over 10 days reveals the connectivities of actors in this network and allows us to visualize this in relation to their geographic location. Mutual aid groups arose because of a phenomenon of social connectivity. Actor network theory suggests that it's likely to be a direct result of pre-existing working relationships. So this is Bruno Latour's actor network theory. As it was seen to be distributed first around geographical hubs, these spun off into a scale-free network. Mutual aid groups emerged in the west of the city before the east, and the east emerged more slowly. This implies that the networks that formed these mutual aid groups were more prevalent in the east. There were several mutual aid deserts where no groups formed, and the most evident being the north of the city. The areas later were in higher need of food, and support corresponds with the mutual aid deserts. Although this does not mean the reciprocal support does not exist in these areas at all, and as some support might be outside the lens of these mutual aid groups, it does imply there's a correlation to the areas isolated within the wider city's network of social relations and the experience of food insecurity in a time of significant crisis. And actor network theory goes on to suggest that this reflects a lack of groups in those areas, which is, Bruno Latour would connect that to a lack of kind of shared work or shared kind of group work. So the kind of what we saw were the groups that were continuously recreating groups in their local areas, were kind of able to do or mobilize better, mobilize in a time of crisis, essentially. So this has all sorts of implications for in the kind of social sciences, as it's not just talking about the networks within which people can mobilize in a crisis, but it's also visualizing the networks that exist within the city, the cultural capital that exists within the city, as 90% of what people earn is based on their social capital, the places, networks and opportunities that make up their present circumstances, according to Herbert Simon, who's an award, a Nobel Prize winning social scientist. So, yeah, when mapped together, these multiple factors show an intersection that high levels of food insecurity are directly related to these areas where kind of social networks are in a deficit because of a lack of group interaction and so on. So we realized this quite early on in the National Food Service Network, and we're like, well, this is bad, and we need to create a system to distribute food, not just within the mutual aid networks or within a mutual aid groups, but actually connect with kind of state support and distribute it within the already organized hubs. So we saw this phenomenon occurring, and this is where we kind of built this strategy of actually, what if we can create an intermediary point between the state and the mutual aid groups as registered organizations and registered hubs, and kind of integrate with those to distribute. And that kind of strategy was something that was shipped out and distributed to Nottingham and distributed to many different councils and departments in the National Food Service Network. So it was really useful as a plan. But, essentially this is the kind of a parcel heat map of Sheffield after over 15,000 emergency meals were distributed during COVID. And it's quite a unique data set, but it shows us the probability of food insecurity very clearly, not just during the pandemic, but also after the pandemic. So it's visible now, but the idea and the reality is that this is an ongoing problem, and this new data and this new mapping we have allows us to see very clearly which areas might need support or might benefit from support and community level interventions in the near future in order to build the social relations to deal with the crisis adequately in the future. So really interesting how this relates to the kind of mutual aid groups in the city. Also really interesting as to how it relates to community hubs, like I mentioned, and how that kind of phenomenon occurred. But, comparing against lots of different peers, you find that there is a slight break from the indices of multiple deprivation, so showing that food insecurity is not the indices of multiple deprivation is not the clearest indicator of food insecurity. So that's new data, and that's really interesting. And something we should build on when we're thinking about interventions in the future, both at a local community level, but as at a kind of council level. So it can be shown quite clearly. So this, with the spots here, you can see the COVID-19 deaths, and it's kind of misleading because the area with that big spot is an area in Sheffield which has a hospital in it. So I wouldn't take that I would take that with a pinch of salt. But essentially, the idea is that, or the kind of findings that when during COVID-19, giving food support to people lowered their risk of venturing out of the house and potentially potentially, sorry, I'm struggling for my words, but potentially catching COVID-19, and also like lowering the possibility of a higher death toll than was necessary. So essentially allowed people to stay in their house during the height of the crisis, who are extremely vulnerable or kind of like were ill. And this is really important because although a lot of the most of the emergency food support in the city didn't have so much kind of governmental support, it was entirely needed. And also the value of a human life, a single human life, for the entire city's kind of emergency support would by far supersede the kind of economic amount that was given, during COVID-19. So it was just over £1 million, but like the value of a human life, even in insurance terms, is far higher than the entirety of food support given during COVID-19. So, I don't want to get too economical about it, but, the Environmental Protection Agency values a statistical life at over 10 million in today's money. So if only one life was saved, it would completely economically kind of outweigh the costs. So, I won't go into that anymore, but here's a fun illustration. During COVID-19, we also built a lot of systems that overcame these anxieties that people normally face when kind of going to a food bank, or experiencing food insecurity, that were entirely fabricated to make people feel bad, essentially. The bureaucracy and all of the kind of things that people feel like you need to do to someone who's in need of emergency food support, turns out don't really need to happen, and you can just distribute it more liberally, and there will be a plateau at which that distribution kind of irons out. So there won't be many more people asking for food after a certain point, because those are the people in the city in need, and you should probably help them if they're in need. So the idea is that we kind of like had an open arms approach. We allow people to access it in the way that Samaritans allows people to access their phone service. Like, it's not a problem. You can have it. It's fine. This is something we're giving, and there's no stigma, and we can help, rather than having to queue up or kind of have this intense or horrible situation where you're kind of screened. Are you sure you need food right now? It's like, well, even if we paid for the entire city's emergency food support, it would still not cost that much in relative terms to some of the larger banking bonuses that we see in the City of London. So, like, where does this lead us in terms of kind of the future? Leads us to a lot of places, but essentially the future can't really be predicted so much, but you can kind of like figure out things that are happening, and so by looking at the weak signals of the future, things that might happen, milestones that are already in place within society, that we know are going to kind of probably happen, and the things that we've already done that are coming back to bite us right now that we shouldn't have done, but we did do. So, that's there. So like, here's some, some things that are kind of pressing in the global scheme of things. Is like, well, there's been a big psychological shift around away from centralization to decentralized kind of networks and decentralized forms of thinking because of the internet. The communications revolution brought on this and allowed us to think in a different way. And that psychological shift has now meant we're starting to organize in a different way and also organize a lot more efficiently. So kind of our services and our organizations are showing that we're changing. And during COVID-19, we saw a decentralized approach to welfare provision and a potential for a new public service provision. So how that looks in the future is we can build on that. Climate change, we know that's going to happen. So we need to have, or, you know, it's weak signal that it's going to happen. So we have to kind of make interventions now. Yeah, more potential cataclysmic events. A lot of voluntary labour expanding because of the automation, etc., etc. I'm not going to go too much into this, but you can all think of way more than I've put here. These are just things that I just splurged out of my mind when I was writing this about a little while ago. So yeah, we should see COVID as warnings of what's next to come, and not just the kind of thing that like just happened and we've dealt with it. It's actually, we've created an infrastructure or the beginnings of something that we can build on as a system, and we should deploy a kind of a more what you call a acupunctural approach to like see what we've had, see what's there more clearly, and kind of like make tiny changes in the right areas over the next kind of 3 or 4 years to deploy a kind of like an asset-based community development cycle, which allows lots of different community groups to like develop on the assets and build on the assets in their areas and kind of link these projects together. Also, like, we've got the fundamentals of something that could be much bigger than it is right now. Like, we've got these phone lines and we've got these kind of support systems that are existing. Do we just close them down completely? Is that what we do now? Like, now that everyone's got food, like, you know, and COVID-19 is subsiding and the markets can really take care of it all again? Well, no, because these people, you know, probably were in food insecurity and definitely were in food insecurity before the pandemic. So what we can do is start to build new welfare services and new kind of systems of well-being support and purpose and identity on top of these systems. So if people are in need of food support, it probably means that they need kind of network support, or they kind of need some kind of well-being or kind of purpose support that follows the logic of something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you can begin to develop on the base of something larger, kind of more integrated and more rooted services that allow people to kind of like phone up really easily in their moment of high need, but also perhaps we can build on that. And also, like, something I thought about, this is a really wavy sketch right now, but something I thought about during COVID was that we made something like, it's like socialism that tests rather than it's just politics, you know? So we like tested it and it works, and then we kind of like, we can do it, you know, and we don't really need to wait for politics to enact socialism, because we can kind of start doing socialism, you know, and like building socialism and like, you know, kind of developing social infrastructures, refine ideas and build them in a kind of market, you know, of socialism, which was, you know, is something we did during COVID, and we saw that effect happened, and we can do that, you know, use that explosive this is what Slavoj Zizek calls the explosive productive power of capitalism, but without the capitalist form. So how do we facilitate this explosive productive power? You know, we need to make new economic systems that kind of like look at how we fund people in these organizations. I'm not going to go into that too much, but, you know, essentially some short-term interventions we might make are just kind of like mutual aid. You know, how do we develop and build on the mutual aid groups we've got? What are the things we can do to make them a little bit kind of more advanced, rather than just cutting them loose, you know, kind of changing them and evolving them and scaling them up? Building community facilities, is that possible? Is that what's desired in those communities? How do we change the narrative around food banks, you know, national kitchens? How do we change our society's values through space? And how do we kind of start governmentally planning for a national food service? One thing I would say I'm quite certain about, if we try, we could probably end food insecurity. I'm just going to throw that one out there. It's like, we could probably kind of like end food insecurity by just building on what we've made during COVID quite easily within a few years. And we should lobby for that. And we shouldn't like let the opportunity slip away or pretend that the market's now going to fix everything, because actually, like, there's a lot more to do. And I think that, that's basically me. So hopefully I didn't ramble too much, and hopefully it was a nice presentation for you all. Thank you for listening. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks for that, Louis. You've completely ran over, but I can't be upset because you are just so inspiring, and there are so many compelling arguments for why we need to revamp the welfare state and why we need a national food service. So thank you so much, as Beth has just put in the chat. Sean. So next up, we have Sean Parker. Sean is an artist, community cook, and local contact for the National Food Service in South London. He ran Brixton Pound Cafe, a radical pay-what-you-can community cafe using surplus food saved from landfill and supporting young people with learning difficulties and autism. He produces fermentation workshops for charities and galleries around the country to promote diet diversity, cut food waste, and sustain good mental health. Thanks, Sean.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm currently in Lithuania on a residency, so it's like a bit later over here. I hope you can all hear me. I'm not going to have a presentation, visual presentation. I'm just going to kind of rattle off kind of like micro lecture about 3 main points, which is going to be around food sovereignty and food justice, and how pay-what-you-can models could be should be the future of social eating spaces, connecting food, farming and land workers to community kitchens, and also introducing wild food back into our diets. So yeah, thanks for the intro. I mean, I wrote it myself, but yeah, that gives you a general idea of who I am and what I do. Yeah, I describe myself as like an eco-anxious environmentalist and cook. So I have a studio practice where I kind of adapt pre-industrial craft techniques to work with post-consumer materials. And then I also do lots of community projects, kind of using collaboration as a methodology, as a kind of problem-solving tool, and really trying to strengthen alternative currencies and skill sharing as a way of like kind of imagining post-capitalist framework structures for like building local resilience and redistributing materials. So as a local contact, I first hooked up with National Food Service about a year ago. I was invited to do a talk with lovely Elliot at the Food and Farming March, which is organised by the Land Workers Alliance in the Oxo Tower in London, and kind of been waving the flag ever since. Was kind of running events on behalf of the NFS in my Brixton Pound project, but also have been helping other local food projects get up and running, get the resources that they need, integrate themselves in with the national network, and have been sort of a point of contact with inquiries and opportunities in South London. So yeah, I mean, I'll kind of skip over what Brixton Pound was because we kind of already went there in my intro. But the main aims were to reduce food waste, tackle income inequality, and engage socially isolated people in the area. And I mean, this is very, very similar to Foodhall. I mean, almost identical, even though we were operating completely separately. So when I went, I was just kind of blown away that there was a really similar, almost identical project in a different city that was kind of so on the nose, like so along the same lines. And I just felt really, really invigorated and really like emboldened to sort of carry on the sort of food justice work that I've been doing. Brixton's been like aggressively gentrified for almost a decade, and so providing a free to use space with tasty, affordable food and activities like yoga, Reiki, life drawing meant that we had a really great a range of wonderful and interesting people from different age groups and backgrounds that used to use the cafe regularly. I like to think about the pay what you can model as one that not only sort of demonstrates how to provide affordable and nutritious food with few resources, but also as a platform for creating local friendships, building community trust and autonomy, and also experimenting with alternative currencies. So we create a non-judgmental environment which removes the risk of poverty shaming, which is so prevalent in neoliberal city interpersonal dynamics. So a bit of a mouthful. The idea that what you pay what you can afford has a subtext of asking privileged folks to consider their position and how best they can contribute and the running of the project. It also allows those who can offer their time, skills, labour in a sort of unique non-financial stake of the project. And I think this is really important to do with moving forward, helping new community projects set up around the country, and kind of removing some of the power of like sort of pure money as like the singularity, the singular currency. When obviously we all know that everyone has so much more to offer, and some people just don't have money. So the traditional power dynamic of the who in most hospitality situations would automatically assume the dominant role is because they're spending the money, and traditionally it's deemed that the customer is always right. This is anyone who knows, who's worked in a pub or a restaurant, is a very oppressive relationship for service workers. In a pay-what-you-can scenario, we're looking very much in a paradigm shift where the staff, the volunteers, and the patrons become much closer, and in the sort of traditional hierarchies are dissolved to some extent. The emphasis to invite, engage, and support customers, regardless of how much they can pay, displays an awareness of the needs of those who might feel excluded from communities. I believe that when properly organised and centrally funded, the pay-what-you-can model adopted by many social eating spaces already, including ones run by NFS and our affiliated projects across the country, it really has the potential to create an upheaval of the archaic and toxic relationships that can form unchallenged in neoliberal spaces, and help create a very special, dynamic, inclusive environment that will soon, I think, will soon become prevalent on high streets, in estates, and institutions across the country. So many food justice projects rely on surplus food, working with charities, skipping, receiving donations directly from locals, neighbours, or from suppliers. If there is enough money in the project, food will also be purchased in, but the connections are understandably fairly precarious at the best of times, with common issues like transport, lack of volunteers, food going out of date or rotting. So this can mean that spending unnecessary funds on buying in low quality food from supermarkets, which is one of the institutions that kind of contributes to food insecurity in the first place, because of the price and the privatisation of abundance. And that's obviously a huge problem in the city, where businesses restrict access to leftovers. So to create a fairer food future, particularly facing Brexit and COVID, we need to consider how important it is to build stronger ties with UK-based producers. Why are we importing vegetables from across the globe in ever increasingly carbon expensive methods? Where have I gone? So, why are we importing vegetables across the globe in ever increasing carbon expensive methods which don't ensure farmers' welfare and exploit workers at all points in the chain? In the UK, we have a fine history of land workers producing highly nutritious and diverse crops, producing around 3.5 million tonnes of fruit and veg every year. Food justice charity Feedback found that farmers who took part in a survey said that they lost up to 37,000 tonnes of crops. They were left in the field to rot after they were passed on by supermarkets to purchase. They didn't want to purchase them because it was cheaper to buy them from other countries. So this is astounding because the figure also hides all of the labour and materials costs to the farmers, and it represents a huge financial burden to them, and to farmers who are already struggling from the sort of lack of subsidies and the centralisation of funds. So the expertise of our nation of land workers has been abused and overlooked for many years. I think bringing the NFS forward, we need to be thinking about how we can support farmers and land workers and integrate their skills, knowledge and produce back into the process of feeding communities. This is already being done by Feedback, who I already mentioned, through their gleaning network, which takes volunteers to farms, picks abandoned crops and redistributes them to community kitchens, preservers and small businesses. This is exactly the sort of resourceful thinking that I think can get food to emergency projects in both rural and urban areas, and creates new networks of transporters and a sort of new, more resilient local supply chain to the growers. Having said this, the well-being of farmers and land workers should be our top priority. We need to be buying their produce rather than receiving it for free, so we can put it on the tables in our network of social eating spaces. Their work is unequivocally important in caring for and renaturing our soils, which have been ravaged by aggressive agribusiness and extractive capitalist practices for decades. Everything comes from the soil because everything comes from plants. I'm just going to read a real quick quote I wrote earlier this year. If brackets, when there is a food shortage this year because of unseasonal weather, brackets, see the climate crisis, COVID-19, brackets, see capitalism epidemic, and lack of land workers, see brackets, racist conservatives, we better realise the fragility of a just-in-time global food system which relies so heavily on the oppression of the working classes to grow, transport and sell it. And we need to understand the unique importance of learning how to find, grow and preserve our own. The terms foraging, organic and farming have become classed and their meanings degraded to pure aesthetics. Wild food and the cultivated versions grown by skilled craftspeople are the root, leaf and flower of all cuisine, of all medicine and of all community. Okay. Cool. So the future of the funding strategies of NFS and other national food justice programs must include integrating fair payment to farmers and land workers and support for increasing opportunities for black and brown farmers who will bring a wealth of new energy, expertise and ideas for creating sustainable food futures. My feelings around the commons are becoming increasingly pressing as the threats to reduce the amount of usable countryside and the increase of punishment for trespassing have kind of come really, really strongly into the news recently. So not only does England have a class issue in the capital, in the cities and towns, but it also has it in the countryside as well. I don't need to say too much about why it's reprehensible that landowners are given more and more power and the public receive less and less access. But this naturally will have a catastrophic effect on how we obtain and learn about wild food. I am a huge advocate of introducing wild food into our diets. I do lots of identification walks, scavenging, make lots of drinks, drinking a little wild soda right now. And this is not only because food, obviously all food came from the wild, but also because of the incredible depth of nutrition that it can add to our bodies. Harvesting this free, abundant, delicious resource is key to helping increase biodiversity in areas that are susceptible to being colonized by fervent species, for instance, nettles, dandelion, three-cornered leek, which are all in band 9, the highest band of invasive species in London. But they're all also absolutely packed with nutrients, oils, and flavour. So actually harvesting them is contributing to positive balance in the biodiversity of plants in our green spaces. We can also see how eating wild food can decarbonise our diets, cancel any labour or refrigeration costs, reduce the negative environmental impacts of transport, and create opportunities to connect with nature, help us regain some of the control over the food that we are putting into our bodies. Going blackberry picking is one of the most fun things you can do on a drizzly day in autumn with your friends. There are literally tens of plants that many consider weeds that taste better, keep for longer, and contain more iron and vitamin C than any packet of spinach flown over from Portugal ever could. The need to access this bounty is so important in our cultural history, our local values, and the way in which we share a relationship with our natural environment. The National Food Service has already integrated wild foods into many of its kitchens, and by making stronger connections with local experts and enthusiasts, there is an opportunity to reinvigorate our love for scavenging and to regain some degree of sovereignty over our food system in the near future. Thank you.
Sean, thank you so much. There's a lot in that we can take from, and I think like connecting with UK farmers and land workers and land growers is something that we're really thinking about at the moment. So if there's anyone that's watching who feels like they've got knowledge of this and would like to join in the discussion, then please sign up on the NFS website. And I know that I would, and a lot of the NFS members would love to engage in that conversation with you. So thank you both for the presentations. We, rather than doing a Q&A, we were thinking that tonight we'd open it up a little bit for a dialogue with you guys to hear your ideas on the future of the food system, on the National Food Service within this. And I'd still like, if people are around, to have that opportunity. So I know we're going to run over a little bit, and obviously you guys can leave if that works for you, but I know that Louis is happy to stick around, and Sean, you got any? Yeah. So we'll get it going, and then if people need to leave as and when, then please feel free. But I feel it's important that if people have time, we have this opportunity to engage in a dialogue. So I guess a good place to start with that is we have a question from Kieran, which keeps escaping my scroll. So it doesn't have to be questions, but any ideas from you guys, please symbol in the chat if you'd like to speak, or, but we'll start with this one. So the National Food Service aims for food security, but doesn't mention food sovereignty, which instead emphasizes the wider global context of capitalist power relations and control of peoples over their food systems. I've just lost the question. The People's Food Policy in the UK emphasises food sovereignty as its vision. Why doesn't the National Food Service?
I can answer.
Yeah. Sounds good.
So Yeah, I mean, it's not that we don't. I think that, like, we definitely do. And in fact, we've had a lot of we've gone to talks and kind of formed alliance systems with the Land Workers Alliance, the People's Food Policy before. So we've read it, and really, yeah, like a lot of people within the community are really aware of it, and it's kind of solidarity. It's just a matter of slowly integrating it into the kind of like larger manifesto, which we're building on a collaborative basis at the moment. So not all things are articulated just quite yet, unfortunately. But yeah, I think that, like, as we emerge from COVID-19 and build a larger national food service manifesto that is kind of like a collaborative document that lots of different groups and people can contribute to, we'll be building that in.
Yeah, I could just add something to that as well. Thinking about where the origins of the National Food Service come from and who's involved, it just means that, you know, we're still very young, and we're still growing, and so we're hoping to, you know, engage with more people who have a really much deeper understanding of food sovereignty and insecurity, but also, I guess, like through maybe some of the things that I spoke about in my presentation, like we are moving in that direction, and you know, it really depends on who you talk to in NFS, and because everyone has different ideas about what we can be and what we're going to do. And I think actually one of the strengths of NFS is that it can sort of hold multiple ideas, and it can hold multiple realities and multiple projected futures. But yeah, I mean, this is down to the sort of the research materials that we have access to as well.
Nice. We have another question, but whether people want to turn on their cameras and, like, if that's what people want, to have more of like an open discussion, then please feel free to. And like, yeah, if you feel in the position to like ask your question, to have that conversation, then yeah, this is the space to do so. But this question is, hi, is there a place in developing commons of community gardens in towns and cities, and what steps should we take to expand them?
I'm happy to take that if you want, Louis. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it was definitely in my notes for my talk. But I think with regards to making more clear and strong contact with community gardens in urban spaces is another way of connecting with land workers and farmers. Obviously, I think I was just talking about rural, but also we obviously have a lot of amazing organics projects all over cities like London, Manchester, Sheffield, Nottingham. And, you know, the first stage really is for the local kitchens, community kitchens, or the emergency food projects to make contact with those. And, you know, even something so simple as visiting with your compost, you know, your veg peelings from the food prep that you've done that day, is a really like great way of connecting with the growers. And my local garden in Peckham, where I volunteer, we've been growing organics for the mutual aid and for Pekin, which is a food bank. Sorry. So, you know, all of the volunteering hours, all of the efforts, and all of the food have all gone towards directly towards emergency food provision in the local area. So I really see that there's a great opportunity for NFS and affiliated projects, community kitchens, to you know, to reach out to these local projects and try and create you know, like a cyclical, you know, a mutual relationship where we can give them scraps and we can maybe buy food from them.
I think as well, like it ties into like public space affecting people's value systems, and like if there's a lot of public space which can be used for community growing, then the value systems and the views and attitudes of that entices people to grow more and to have those localized food systems, which beyond the food itself have a lot more benefits for well-being. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think that I would see a system of kind of community gardens or common of community gardens. It's kind of like changing the way we see ownership of space, isn't it? Yeah. So it's kind of like, in order to make, I think we can do things radical growth, and at the same time start to push at the boundaries of ownership, and also kind of like the ownership of food. So I think that like that would be in a way utopia, or that that's the ultimate national food service, in the sense of a series of interconnected community and free use growing spots across the city you can go in and kind of like which I feel like that question's really tied in with how we untangle kind of land law, and how we unlock the commons, perhaps with like community land trusts and so on, and how we that facilitates new forms of growing.
Are there any comments, any ideas from anyone? Any further questions? And if not, we can wrap up the session. Just give it a minute. All right then. Apologies.
India. Yes, in India. So are there examples of other parts of the world where community-led social eating spaces have successfully reduced food poverty, insecurity? In fact, historically, many areas of the world. But if you look at India, the kind of Gurdwaras, the Golden Temple, for instance, feeds 200,000 people a day in a completely voluntary economy. So in other cultures, like, this is massive, like, you know, and historically in our own country, community-led social eating spaces were a large part of our civilization. So our own country as well.
Yeah, there's also organisations like Foodhall, which operates in London and also in about 30 other different cities, which, yeah, they operate on a voluntary basis and feed about, I mean, in London they feed about 6,000 people a day, just using surplus. And that comes from Hare Krishna predecessors, and so that's a kind of model that's been passed down, and now it is run by people who are not necessarily from a religious background, but it takes on that kind of that message of providing for the community, and they cycle out tons and tons of you know, delicious curries and bread and cake all over London every single day.
Nice. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone else has any further ideas, would like to open up the discussion, feel free to now. But if not, it's been really nice to virtually see you all over the past 4 weeks. And although the webinars have ended, the campaign for the National Food Service goes on. And if you'd like to get involved, please visit the website, sign up to the newsletter, and yeah, together we can do this. We can build a national food service.
We have community spaces in the UK.
So
okay.
I'll read out the comment just so everyone who's listening can see it. So I guess my point is more to do with the impact on governmental policy in those places, and whether food security can be tackled on a national scale. We have community food spaces in the UK, but food poverty is still a huge issue. For example, India is a great example, but there are still almost 200 million people undernourished in India.
I can jump in if you like. I just think in terms of what the NFS is trying to do is, it's like a two-pronged attack really, isn't it? Because we have a national campaign which is trying to influence policy in a regional and national scale through, writing policy documents and putting pressure on local councils and in throwing our weight behind national policy writing. But then we also have the kind of on the ground local, like hyper local strategy, which is more to do with skilling up and gluing together, tackling local issues with local ideas. So in terms of the kind of the National Food Service not being like an opposition to or like one solution to national hunger, but gradually, I feel like that's expecting the government to kind of do that is one thing, and I really don't think that they have the desire to. You can, Kieran, of course, yes. You one sec. But I feel like the multiplicity and the kind of the rhizomatic, the kind of fungal-like growth of community growing spaces and food justice projects is something where we're more focusing on this kind of the resilience of grassroots networks. And yeah, I feel like this is probably the thing that we're going for most with the campaign is, like finding the surplus in cities and finding the surplus in towns, whether it's surplus space or surplus time, surplus energy, surplus food.
If you're looking for further examples as well, you should check out Belo Horizonte, which was become known worldwide as the city that ended hunger. And they did it in 1993. And yeah, so they launched a food security program that almost eliminated hunger, reduced poverty, and created price stability, and generated rural sustainability and a thriving agricultural sector. So that's in Brazil. And so the examples are fragmented. Also, the fact the contestation about India still having a lot of food poverty, we have to look at that in the lens of historic colonialism and ask ourselves whether it's the food system that failed or it's the globalized capital assault that failed India. And I think it's the latter, actually. So I think that we should unpick whether or not these things work or fail from the assault of capital on them, because actually in kind of the Vaishnava premise in kind of India and historic India, community food sharing spaces were functioning as a genuine means to eliminate food insecurity without the apparatus of capital. So it has been done in kind of modern society in cities like Belo Horizonte, and there are communal eating spaces in those, but also historically it's been done, and we should look at the different times as different countries sometimes, you know, in the sense that actually like things were different at different points in time.
Cool. I think Kieran had a point.
Oh yeah, hi. Yeah, actually, yeah, what you've just been saying about the kind of the various ways that food insecurity has been addressed in different communities around the world is kind of partially, I think, answered what I was going to say, which is, I was just asking for maybe a bit more discussion on like the kind of general theory of change from the grassroots level to the government level, and how to make that more resilient. Because I just wonder with Belo Horizonte, because obviously that was like a key case that inspired a lot of the food policy councils around the world, Canada, Toronto, and also Bristol. But is Belo Horizonte still, are those policies and are those actions, are they still in place? Have they been resilient to Bolsonaro? And I wonder, like, what strategies are there to make these kinds of common spaces and access to food independent of changing political settings? How do we protect those spaces when you get a right-wing government that comes in and tears it all down? Yeah.
Louis?
I will open. I mean, I can give a quick answer, but public commons partnerships would be, you know, exploring that and actually developing that through real systems like the National Food Service, but potentially other public common systems. So not just looking at public-private kind of partnership systems, which kind of take away or suck away the wealth, but actually developing systems where commons groups and trusts start to hold assets if they are to be privatized in a kind of impermeable kind of way, so that the legislation stops any further privatization, because those effectively are kind of so it would be kind of designing those trusts or those systems of public commons partnerships. I think we could see some way of advancing that, because if you look at community land trusts, talking about India again, they actually emerged from Mahatma Gandhi's salt marches first. So Gandhi was concerned about the lack of land insecurity of rural, poor rural people. So he persuaded a lot of wealthy landowners to distribute kind of land to those in need. But as soon as it was distributed, another wealthy landowner sprung on those people and was like, and took, you know, the land for a kind of a small price, but to the people who they were paying, it was a really large price. So the way of protecting it was then to make a series of kind of trusts, or these were the first ever community land trusts that kind of started to build a protection system of local kind of holders of land. There's a way of, I think, constructing the state apparatus alongside commons apparatus and creating a long-term defensibility strategy for kind of common good, if we're intelligent enough about it. I think there's potential there. That would be my 2 cents anyway.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it'd be helpful to have some, I don't know what your kind of reading is on it, like what resources you use to learn about that, or what, if it's from like key papers or institutional reports, or I don't know if there's anything you can think of on the top of your head that would be interesting to read further.
Yeah, Commonwealth think tank write a lot about public commons partnerships. They're really cool. I love their work. Like, they're incredible. And I think there's that suggestion's really powerful, you know, especially in the wake of like ongoing and relentless privatization. I think there's something really good in there. So, and how the communities we kind of work to build those kind of systems, knowing that we're probably going to have a conservative government for a while at least, is quite important for us as socialists or anarchists.
Hi, could I just come in on that, just to add, how much room do you reckon we can push for community, local council and state kind of cooperation at a council local level and not just the state?
Mm. Should I answer? Does anyone else want to answer that? Because I like the idea of it forming into a discussion. I think that would be cool if someone else in the audience wanted to answer. The deafening silence. I think it's getting to me, the deafening silence. Okay, I'll try to answer it. At local council level, it really depends, I guess, on the local council that we have. Like up in Sheffield, we're not having much kind of realistic progress. A lot of it's done by the grassroots and done by the communities themselves. With the council, I think there's a lot. I think at the higher structural level, or kind of policy, larger policy implementation level, there's possibly more opportunity. So we're collaborating with groups like the Green New Deal or Labour for a Green New Deal, and those kinds of kind of activists, more like political activists, because we are like kind of, normally most people involved in the network so far are kind of doers and we kind of get things done, and we also think and share things, but start to build these models which hopefully can begin to kind of like cascade and inform policy, and you know, if they're articulated well enough. So other political groups are starting to kind of like see, you know, and a lot of them are heavily involved in the work, like, you know, grassroots organizing. A lot of people who are interested in politics end up becoming quite involved with it. So I think that it's kind of like, yeah, doing the thing itself, and then this idea of having an idea-led politics, where actually the struggle for reality is in the city and not just in the, you know, the politics is really in the reality. Like if we can really make these things, then real change will happen, you know, like in real time. And if we just talk about politics, we might always talk about politics, and actually we, you know, we might not be testing the real thing, you know, like so it's about testing and rigorously doing things and believing that real change, real innovation just changes everything. So all we have to do is keep really innovating, and then everything else will follow suit.
Can I agree with that, please? So I'm coming at this from a really kind of micro level. I cook for some old dears, and they cannot, because they're at high risk. We've got no prospect of bringing them back together again, putting them in the same room again. It's just very difficult. So as soon as we went into lockdown, because we have a small amount of council funding, I was all over our friends at the council, I'm in Sheffield too, saying, how can we continue to provide some sort of social aspect, some sort of togetherness for our people that we're responsible for? And they just didn't have any ideas. They cannot afford to have any ideas at the council. Every penny that you get in funding from them is so hidebound with regulations and restrictions, and they have to come and vet you for every new proposal that you have, and they have to do the paperwork on it. And in the end, the easiest thing for me to do was to say, we won't take your funding, and therefore we're not subject to your oversight. We'll just provide them with Meals on Wheels and a cheery newsletter, and that way we'll keep some sense of social togetherness for as long as this takes. And as soon as we can get them back together in the same room again for a social eating experience, which, you know, some of them are going mad with loneliness now. that's what we'll do. But we'll do it without the council funding. We'll do it without the political oversight. That's it.
Sounds incredible. Would love you to join the network.
Yeah.
Please join. This sounds great. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think that work is like really commendable because of the scale that you're doing it on as well. I was just cooking once a week for our disabled and neurodiverse friends in Brixton, and I was just kind of cooking myself, and I had a few cyclists delivering the food, and I had one volunteer who would call up all the beneficiaries and just have like a 5-10 minute chat with them. And I realized that within my resources, like there was no way of, doing anything more than that. And so, the consistency of it was really key, and just like being really, keen to continue it, and knowing how much it meant to the individuals, kept it going. So like the scale of that project was I knew that we weren't getting any central funding, and I knew that it wasn't going to happen. So I could kind of just carry on with it, and I knew that it was a good service for those people in the community. But I knew that it wasn't going to be able to get any bigger.
Yeah.
Without access to money, or without access to volunteer network, or without access to cars. So like the NFS is like kind of supportive of trickles of all sorts of projects that, whether it's Bristol, who is the second biggest provider of emergency food provision in the whole city, or whether it's you cooking for your old lovies like once twice a week, or weekly. So these all projects of all shapes and sizes exist, and it's really important that we provide resources and support for them regardless. Not all of them are going to make the scale up, and to be honest, like it's probably more important that you're doing it off your own back than having the council kind of stick the nose in and tell you that you need to meet certain criteria in order to like unlock pots of money.
Absolutely agree, and I'll just, because I have said my piece now, I just say it's been really useful. It's been really encouraging and helpful to hear about how people have scaled up, and how people have joined the dots between people who have time and skills to offer, and people who need those time and skills. Absolutely solidarity, not charity. And thank you everyone who's given your time and your information.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. I think that's a really nice part to wrap the conversation up. But please, let's continue the dialogue. I've put the email in the chat box. Would love to connect that way, and also through social media, through Twitter, through Facebook, through the website, through newsletters. I think it's a really important conversation to continue, and movement to build. And like Louis says, like, let's get the work done on the ground and prove that the system is, it's needed, and that they don't have to build it. It's already been built, and that it would just be ridiculously silly not to invest in, basically. So thank you everyone for joining again. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to future chats, future webinars, future conversations. Have lovely evenings. Thank you again, Louis and Sean.